Friends, I'm going to talk about a book today that is called The Exercise of Freedom, an Introduction to Dalit Literature, edited by Susie Tharu and K. Satyanarayana, and this is published by Navayana. Um, this is a publishing house which is well known really for its uh, relentless pursuit of what it thinks of as good Dalit literature and related literature on Ambedkar, on the politics of caste, and so on. And this book was published in 2013. Once again, an introduction to Dalit literature. Now, this book is about 180 odd pages. There are quite a few anthologies that have been published of Dalit literature, and there are, of course, a great many Dalit writers who have excelled in poetry, some in novels. We also have collections of essays. And the advantage of this anthology, that's typically what anthologies do, is it gives you a little glimpse into that world of that literature with which I suspect many people, even those who read Indian literature reasonably widely, are not familiar. I think the name of Ambedkar is known to everyone, but who really knows about Dalit poets, for example? There was a wonderful anthology that was done many years ago, but that was really largely a literature of Marathi uh, Dalit poetry and fiction. And that was edited by Arjun Tangle, if I remembered, Poison Bread. I think it was called. This is from maybe 25 some odd years ago. And that's when I got my introduction to a number of Marathi Dalit writers. I think the most significant Dalit writers have generally come out from places such as Karnataka and Maharashtra. There are, of course, Dalit writers from the rest of India as well, but those two regions in particular have produced what seems to be a very productive Dalit literature. Now, this book, I think, is a book that is got a very good sampling of some of the writers that one might want to be aware of. Many of these writers were actually new to me. And because it's an anthology, it's not going to be possible to discuss, obviously, all the pieces. And it is certainly the case that the pieces display different kinds of sensibility. But before I give an illustration by looking at two or three of the pieces in this book, it would be worthwhile asking what exactly is Dalit literature? And the answer would seem to be self-evident to people. The answer would be literature written by Dalits. But of course, that's a very simplistic answer in many ways, because the question is, what specifically is the sensibility of Dalit literature? What are the idioms of Dalit literature? So if a novel, for example, is really written which speaks about caste oppression, is it the case that only Dalits have written such novels? And the answer, I think, would be no, that's not necessarily the case. Right? So it's worthwhile really asking, and that is what the introduction by Susie Tharu and K. Satyanarayana in part purports to do. I don't know if it does it very successfully. And in fact, unlike most books which I've recommended, I must say that the introduction to this book, it seems to me, is actually disappointing. So I recommend it not so much for its literature, for its introduction, sorry, but rather for the selections that this anthology offers. And I think that there are a great many reasons why I don't find this introduction compelling, one of which is that it's not able to really articulate what we might call a philosophy of Dalit literature, to be able to identify, so to speak, what might constitute a literature that displays the sensibility of a Dalit, which really thinks about the idioms of literature, which speaks about the interiority of the life of a Dalit. The pieces do that. They speak for themselves in various ways. The introduction doesn't. And I think one of the other difficulties with the introduction, and this might be more particular to me, given my predilection for Gandhi, is that this book, it seems to me, is generated by an animus against Gandhi. Now, of course, one could argue that this is true of Dalit literature generally. And I think that that's a point for serious discussion, right? But it seems to me that in this case, there are some serious errors of judgment, which I think one has to really think about, and which I think mitigate what I would call the effect of this introduction and makes it less compelling. So, for example, on page 9 of this introduction, the authors begin to talk about the Gandhian mobilization of sections of the Indian population, and they argue that his mobilization of the Indian masses, well, let me quote here. The Gandhian mobilization of all sections of Indians to present a united force to challenge British rule obscured many questions of inequalities amongst Indians, most importantly, the questions of freedom from slavery and untouchability. Now, I think this is an argument which, made at a level of generality, certainly has some merit to it, because we know that within the Indian National Congress and within the nationalist movement as a whole, there were many advocates of Indian nationalism, many nationalists, as they're called, whose position was that we're going to speak about the problems that afflict relations between Indians. We're going to speak about questions of caste and social reform after we have achieved political independence from the British. Because if we do this at this juncture, let's say in the 1920s, 1930s, this is going to derail political independence. Now, I think that it is certainly the case that many of the nationalists were not attentive to questions of social reforms, to questions of the oppression of the Dalits, to questions of caste more generally to what we might call questions of social inequality. Of course, this is, I think, true of all nationalist movements all over the world, all anti-colonial movements, that they mobilize the people on certain issues, largely political independence. So this is not particular to the Indian nationalist movement by any stretch of the imagination. But wherein then lies the error of judgment? The error of judgment lies in their argument that Gandhi himself was culpable in this respect. Now, here I have to differ very strongly. So they say, okay, here I'm quoting them. So they're talking about Ambedkar, and they say Dalits, quote, he said, had special needs. So he asked that they be recognized as a minority requiring special attention to Indian society. This demand was quickly dismissed as anti-national and by implication pro-British. In sum, Gandhi gave priority to anti-colonial political struggle, which he said would solve all other problems, while Ambedkar argued that social equality among the Indians was as important as independence. Yes, Ambedkar certainly argued that, but so did Gandhi. To say that Gandhi gave priority to anti-colonial political struggle, which he said would solve all other problems, he never said that. And his entire life was dedicated to the very opposite proposition. One cannot begin to understand the constructive program, for example. One cannot begin to understand the fact that he was so devoted to the constructive program, to questions of Hindu-Muslim unity, to questions of social eradication of evils, and that he alone of all the anti-colonial figures placed this at the same level as liberation from colonial rule. This argument goes back to 1909, to Hind Swaraj, when he said that if we simply want the white Sahib to replace, the brown Sahib, to replace the white Sahib, okay, then what good is independence? He was very clear about this from the outset. And I think that this introduction is littered with what I'm going to describe as not simply animus against Gandhi, but with errors of judgment. So then why am I recommending this book? Because this is part of the series of talks over the last few years about books that I have gained something from, books from which I have derived pleasure. And I recommend it because I have derived pleasure from nearly all the selections. So I certainly give credit to the editors for having given us a very fine selection of Dalit literature. Now, what are some of the pieces? Let me just take up two or three of them very briefly. So one of these pieces is an excerpt. So in some cases, we have poems in their entirety, we have short pieces in their entirety, and in many cases, we also have excerpts from much larger works, works that will quite unlikely not be read by the vast majority of people, and which may not even be known to all Dalit scholars, because Dalit literature now really is a growing field. And there are really dozens of novels already, even in English translation, not to mention the amount of literature that still remains untranslated. So let me begin first with, and I'll be very brief, with an excerpt called The Story of My Sanskrit by Kumud Pawde, a Dalit woman born into a family, um, a Mahar family, so from the same caste group that Ambedkar came from, born in Nagpur, Maharashtra, and Kumud Somkuvur, born in 1938, chose to study and then teach Sanskrit. Imagine, that is what she's saying. That is, of course, the very assumption on which she thinks she can write a compelling story. And she's entirely right. Imagine a Dalit woman wanting to study Sanskrit, the language of the Brahmins, the preserve of the Brahmins, and then among them the preserve of Brahminical males. And she's coming from Maharashtra, and Pune, nearby Pune, was one of the citadels of Brahmin orthodoxy, right? And imagine this Dalit woman wanting to study Sanskrit, doing so, and then teaching Sanskrit to others. So that's what this excerpt is really about. There are some extraordinary passages. She talks about, for example, growing up in a neighborhood, and then in the vicinity were, of course, upper caste homes as well. And she would constantly be taunted when people heard that, oh, here goes that Dalit woman, right? Here goes that little girl, and she thinks she can study Sanskrit. Isn't that amusing? Right? Well, isn't that amazing? This is much later on. So you're teaching Sanskrit at the government college, are you? That's very gratifying, I must say. The words are quite ordinary, comments our writer, Kumud Pawde, right? Their literal meaning is straightforward, but the meaning conveyed by the tone in which they are said torments me in many different ways. In what former life have I committed a sin that I should have to learn Sanskrit even from you? All our sacred scriptures have been polluted. She says this is what she heard in that tone. This is what haunted her. And of course, the question is, how did she really persist in doing all of this, right? And this is what she narrates. And what she learns is, she says, I heard an expression once, and that expression stayed with me. What comes by birth but can't be cast off by dying, that is caste. You were born into this caste, you can die and you'll still be in this caste, right? She also points out that she did have a couple of upper caste Hindus, Brahmins, who taught her and who encouraged her. And similarly, That's not true, of course, of the bulk of the community. And that similarly, there were people in her own community that she came from who also taunted her and said, why do you want to study the language of the Brahmins? What makes you think you can do that? Right? And and she says that when she was younger and she would walk by, she would be taunted by these girls. And sometimes she had been told that, oh, here at this distance, these are the homes of these Brahmins, and they're splendid. And she says, I understood the literal meaning of the word splendid, but she couldn't understand why it should be applied to them, because what makes a person splendid? Simply the fact that they're Brahmin, or is it their character, or is it their conduct towards others, right? And here I quote her, the girls who studied along with me were Brahmins or from other higher castes. I had to pass their houses. I paused, waiting casually for their company. Right in front of me, the mothers would warn their daughters, quote, be careful, don't touch her. Stay away from her and don't play with her, or I won't let you into the house again, end quote. These so-called educated, civilized mothers were probably unconscious of the effect of this on my young mind. It wasn't as if I could not understand them. And this is where I really feel what it means to be a young Dalit girl, right? Because what does she say next? Every day I bathed myself clean with Pier's soap. So in India, when we were growing up, I recall this, there was this bar of soap, Pier's, and it was considered to be very elegant. It was a bit more, lot more expensive than, let's say, Lifebuoy, which some people used only for washing clothes, but others used for their daily needs, for bathing and for washing their hands and so on. My mother rubbed camellia oil on my hair and I plaited it neatly. My clothes were well washed and sparkling clean, right? So because she's young, there's a supposition that if you're clean on the outside, then maybe I'll be accepted because then I'm on the clean inside. And of course, the whole story she's telling is about people who purport to be clean on the outside because they're Brahmins and they're dirty inside. And she's not casting aspersion on all Brahmins. She's saying that that was the nature of that culture by and large, right? My mother rubbed camellia oil on my hair and I plaited it neatly. My clothes were well washed and sparkling clean. The girls of my own caste liked to play with me because it enabled them to smell some fragrance. But then she says, what really makes them splendid? What makes them clean? What's more, if one were to compare houses, our house was cleaner than theirs. My mother daily smeared the floor with fresh cow dung. The white powder borders were delicately drawn. The courtyard was well sprinkled and decorated with Rangoli designs. Okay? And so it follows. And she speaks about, as I said, the taunts she get, what it meant to be a Mahar like her, and the encouragement given to her by her father, who had learned the Gayatri Mantra and said, I have learned the Gayatri Mantra. My daughter is going to learn it. My daughter is going to learn Sanskrit. And she says that she felt greatly emboldened by this. And as I said, she mentions one or two Brahmin teachers that she had as well. And then when she finished her bachelor's in Sanskrit, she said, I'm going to do a master's in Sanskrit, right? Our enlightened neighbors laughed when they heard this, as they had before. Some college lecturers and lawyers also joined in the joke. How can that be possible? You may have got good marks at metric, but it isn't so easy to do an MA in Sanskrit. You shouldn't make meaningless boasts. You should know your limitations. Well, I think it would be superfluous of me to continue in this vein, but I do want to say one last thing about this piece. because she ends it on a very interesting note. She said that she finished her master's, then she started work. She couldn't get a job. She eventually um, uh, uh, writes to the Honorable Minister Jagjeevan Ram. Many of you who are listening to me will be unaware of who he was. Jagjeevan Ram was a Dalit minister when I was growing up in the 1970s as a schoolboy, as a young teenager. He was a very prominent figure on the Indian public scene. But he'd been in Indian politics for long before Mrs. Gandhi. He'd been in the cabinet of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, and so she had written a letter to Jagjeevan Ram explaining the difficulties she was having as a Dalit woman who had a master's in Sanskrit and getting a job. And this letter was placed before Jawaharlal Nehru, who sent her an award of 250 rupees and asked her to meet the chief minister of Maharashtra. This is one of those very interesting things about Nehru, which this is not a talk about Nehru, but he had a kind of ecumenism, a Catholicity about him, a generosity about him, all of which has been forgotten in the present climate of opinion where hatred has been built up against him and the entire family. Um, uh, but this is really the punchline here that I want to get to. So while she was waiting for a job, she commenced a second MA in English literature. And then she got married. An intercaste marriage. She says that's a long story. The surprising thing, and here I'll just quote her to the end and just stop and move on to one or two other selections. The surprising thing is that 2 months after my marriage, I got an assistant lectureship in a government college. Deputy Director Sahasra Buddhe, who was on the interview board, was amazed. How did this girl, that is someone of her talent, remain unemployed for 2 years? Today, I am a professor in the famous college where I studied, whose very walls are imbued with the respect I felt for that institution. But one thought still pricks me. The credit for Kumud Somkuwar's job is not hers. That was her maiden name, right? Kumud Somkuwar. But that of the name Kumud Pawade. I hear that a woman's surname changes to match her husband's, and so does her caste. That's why I say that the credit of being a professor of Sanskrit is that of the presumed higher caste status of Mrs. Kumud Pawade. The caste of her maiden status remains deprived. How poignant an ending, how thoughtful. I think it must have been a marvel for her students to have learned Sanskrit from this Dalit woman. Now there's a Dalit Panther's Manifesto. Frankly, far too much has been made of it. It's interesting to see that selection. I don't find it a very compelling selection per se, but it's an important selection because people should be aware of it. I mean, and of course, the Dalit Panthers took their name from the Black Panthers, and this happened in a number of countries. The Black Panthers have also been, in my view, overestimated in various ways. But the Dalit Panthers, how much independence of thought they really displayed is, I think, a very interesting question. And this is not a question that is really posed by the editors when they reproduce this particular manifesto. What you find there is what I would call a rather cliched, simplistic view of Gandhi as well, because partly that manifesto, a small portion of it is a critique of Gandhi, namely that Gandhi was unscientific. Gandhiism means worship of images. When you descend to that kind of level of description of what Gandhi was trying to do, then you can begin to see that there's almost no comprehension of what Gandhi stood for. But even otherwise, independently of that, this manifesto doesn't really display what I would call any independence of thought. The idea is simply take a language of radicalism borrowed from someone else and then apply to what you think are your conditions in your own um, uh, country, right? Now, let me take two more pieces very, very briefly and conclude my discussion with those two pieces. So one is a story. It's called New Custom. And this is found on pages 129 to 137 of the book. It's by Anil Navaria, who's born in Delhi, born in 1972. So the author is now in his early 50s. He has taught Hindi at Jamia Millia. And this story, Ajay Navaria, this story once again is called New Custom. Essentially, what is the story about? There's a man who gets off a bus in some dusty little town, goes to the chai shop next to the bus stop, and orders a cup of tea. While he's waiting for the tea, the, the owner of that tea stall gets into a conversation with him about this and that, and then eventually asks him, "What brings you here?" And this man says, "I've come here for the wedding." And he says, "Oh, really? Whose wedding?" And he mentions a person's name. And this person, the person who runs the chai shop, uh, has a look of bewilderment on his face, because he says, "I've lived in this village and in this neighboring town and this area for a long time. I think I know everyone. And I don't didn't know that this man, there was a wedding going on, and he are you sure that you're going to this person's home?" And then this person mentions this the that is the person who's gotten off from the bus. He mentions the home that he's going to, and it's this person's daughter. And then eventually it clicks for the chai shop owner that he is going to the wedding of another man who is a Dalit with the same name, because this man has a daughter, and the high caste person that he knew of this name didn't even have a daughter. And he was quite astonished, because he says, "I know everything that's going on. I never heard of him having a daughter," right? Or maybe it was a son, I forget exactly. So the point being simply this, that now this chai shop owner begins to understand that my client, who has come to attend the wedding of a Dalit, is almost certainly a Dalit himself. And so when this client is about to leave, he says, "How much do I owe you?" And the shopkeeper says, "3 rupees. But brother, first wash the glass. You've contaminated the glass. You polluted the glass." That's what he's saying. You have to wash it. And of course, the customer, the client, he takes offense at this, right? He says, "Why should I do it?" And the person says, "This is the custom of the village. This is the custom in the village." A rise in status, because when he looks at this client, he was quite well dressed, and so he didn't make any inference that he was a Dalit at all. It's only this conversation that eventually brings him to this realization. This supposition is that you can recognize these people by how they dress. They don't dress well, they look dirty, etc., right? And he says, the shopkeeper, the chai shop owner says, "A rise in status does not put an end to custom." Recall, the story is called New Custom. It doesn't put an end to custom. You might think you have outgrown your Dalit status, but you haven't, right? And so the two of them began to have a little bit of a heated argument, and others come into it, and everyone starts to express their opinion. This chai shop owner is adamant and says, well, you have to. And he says, essentially, and he's joined by a number of people, you're going to get thrashed. And the client says, you just tell me how much I owe you for the glass. Tell me how much. He says, I told you the 3 rupees, but that was for the chai. He says, I'll buy the glass of you. And of course, what does the man do? He just hikes up the price, right? He hikes up the price. Take this, he thrust the 100-rupee note at the shopkeeper. The father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, was smiling on the note, wrapped in a shawl. The shopkeeper quickly grabbed the money. Change, says the client, give me back the change. The man took the change from the shopkeeper, put it in his pocket. Picking up the glass, he threw it and smashed it. And shards spread all over. The man bent down, picked up his suitcase, and started toward the village. A smile bloomed on the shopkeeper's face, a smile not unlike Gandhiji's on the note. Now, of course, you might say that this is also another sly commentary on Gandhi as well. There may be room for ambiguity for some discussion here. I'm going to leave it to you, the reader, to decide that. But it's a fine story. It's a fine story. And the last selection, very briefly, is from, this is from pages 84-90, very well-known writer. In fact, I spoke about another book of his, a short political treatise, A Devastating Indictment of the RSS, Devanura Mahadev. And this is pardon me, sorry. This is not the story I wanted to discuss. The story I wanted to discuss actually is the one by Om Prakash Valmiki. The story is called Joothan. Om Prakash Valmiki, born in 1950, a prominent writer of Hindi literature. And this is drawn from his autobiography, Joothan, published in 1997, which was published really to wide critical acclaim. And here he is describing, it's an autobiography, so he's describing the place where he was born, the layout of the village. He gives some illustration of that. So on the edges of the pond in this village were the homes of the churas. This is the Dalits, people who are really low down. All the women of the village, young girls, older women, even the newly married brides, would sit in the open space behind these homes at the edges of the pond to take a shit. Not just under the cover of darkness, but even in daylight. And that's because, of course, they had no toilets. This has been a fundamental problem. As some of you are aware, in India, the present government, the Modi government, some years ago declared India open defecation free, because there was fairly widespread open defecation. It is not open defecation free, I can assure my listeners, contrary to any claims made by the government or by government agencies. There's enough work done to show that that has not happened even today. But we know of so many situations, and there's good literature, there are good films where women in particular very often wake up at 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. And walk out of the village into the forest a kilometer away so that they can take a shit and not be molested, while they're walking, right? So anyhow, he describes all of this scenario, the basti that he grew up in, and the kind of names that they were called, the taunts that they constantly received, and how rampant, he says, untouchability was so rampant that while it was considered all right to touch dogs and cats or cows and buffaloes, if one happened to touch a chura, one of these Dalits, an untouchable, one got contaminated or polluted. They were not seen as human. They were simply things for use. Their utility lasted until the week was done. Right? They were not treated as humans. They were treated as things to be passed away. What makes this account that he's giving now very compelling is that he says he started going to a school. And then one fine day, the schoolmaster summoned him, gave him a broom, and said, sweep the classroom. And then when he had swept the classroom, he's a student, and he's been singled out to do it. And then when he had swept the classroom, he was told to sweep the courtyard and the entire school. And he thought that, well, I'm being given this punishment for some reason. He's a young boy. And so he does it, and he doesn't tell his parents. And then the second day, the same thing happens. And then the third day, and then one day, his father walked by and saw his son sweeping the courtyard of the school and got infuriated and said, what is going on? Right? And then he explains to his father what the school master has told him, and the headmaster would use abusive language. You know what in Hindi is called maa ki galiyan and bhan ki galiyan, right? Obscenities, right? And he says that his father, Pitaji, when he saw him do it, he confronted the headmaster. And he says that he can never forget how his father stood up for him and stood up for who they were as human beings, right? But he says that these taunts would continue, right? These taunts would continue, and people would say such things as, when has a crow become, what is the point of sending him, your son, to school? When has a crow become a swan? You illiterate, boorish people, what do you know? Knowledge is not gained like this. Hey, if he asked a chura's progeny to sweep, what is the big deal in that? So forth and so on. Right? And he concludes this little excerpt with a description of how his father then had to go to the village pradhan, to the headman, and to local politicians, and to say that, look, my son is entitled to study in school. He shouldn't be asked by the headmaster to be sweeping the floor, right? And it so turned out that the pradhan's son was in the same class as our author, right? And so the pradhan assured him that you can send your son to school and nothing's going to happen to him. So let me conclude with that paragraph, and that will be the end of the discussion of this book. The next day I went to school. This is after the pradhan had told his father, your son can be fearless and go to school. Send him to school tomorrow. The next day I went to school with fear stalking my heart. I sat in class with trepidation. Every second I worried that the headmaster was coming. Now he comes. At the slightest sound, my heart pounded. After a few days, things calmed down, but my heart trembled the moment I saw Headmaster Kaliram. It seemed as though it wasn't a teacher who was coming towards me, but a snorting wild boar with his snout up in the air. End quote. Over time, it is certainly the case that a greater number of Dalit children are going to school. Levels of literacy have increased. Dalits are being placed in wider numbers in jobs. There are still enormous hurdles and obstacles. But is the Dalit really gaining respect? Do upper caste people treat him with the respect due to every person, with the dignity that is or ought to be the birthright of every person? I think there's a serious question mark about that. And I think some of the selections in this book suggest that amply and eloquently.